Hello, everybody. Adam Parks here with Receivables Info, coming to you with a webinar today. These are always my favorites where I get to talk about interesting subjects with some of my good friends. Today, I'm here with Ian Winder from Latitude and Stephanie Clark with VeriFacts to talk about building your data waterfall, how to build your data waterfall and optimize the management of that data that's collected. And I thought that this was an interesting group to bring together for this discussion because Ian's expertise is building the systems that house, manage, and flow data. And Stephanie's background is about generating important data that fits into actually building your waterfall and optimizing your collections and recovery strategies. And I know that both of my guests today are very well known throughout the industry because I've met them at 1,000 different conferences. But why don't we just take 1 minute here and do some quick introductions? Ian, can we start with you? Could you tell everybody just a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Ian Winder, work with Latitude by Genesys here at the Genesys organization. Been with Genesys for a little over 11 years. Prior to that, I spent a lot of time, a long time, on the industry side, running technology for multiple collection agencies, credit grantors, debt buyers, and so on. So good domain expertise, technology, and then now over on the vendor side of the house.
Awesome. Stephanie, how about you?
My name is Stephanie Clark. I'm the managing member and CEO at VeriFacts. I've been with VeriFacts. This March will actually be 21 years. So I've kind of held a lot of different roles within the company. Started out in the sales space, which was just probably the most fun space. And then worked my way up through the company and then became CEO in 2017. And then I'm a lucky gal where 2 weeks before COVID, I ended up buying the company and becoming the managing member. So it's been an interesting post-COVID run.
Okay.
Learned a lot.
That sounds like you found a way to have a lucky streak. Yeah. And I think you guys are bouncing back quite well from the COVID situation. And it's interesting because, like I talked about, I think with this kind of a dynamic talking about building your waterfall, there's really two different areas. And I think you guys cover them really well. So our agenda for today is to talk about, number one, the infrastructure for managing data, because it's great to have all the data in the world, but if you're not managing it and using that data, you can collect everything under the sun, but it's not going to give you the same optimized effect or return on your investment that you can get in other ways. So we're going to talk about the data sources and where you can go to actually get the data that you need to optimize your recovery strategy, how to layer that data in an effective way for insights, right? So you can't just pull one set of data. Data is actually a flowing thing that requires multiple different sources. And then how to measure and adjust your strategy based on the results. So I know that that's kind of high level, but I think this is a good way for us to break down what it is to build that waterfall and how you can manage that information in a way that's effective. But then on the backside, it's all about being able to measure those things, because if you can't measure it, did it ever really happen? Am I right? Come on, Steph. I know that. Yeah. I feel like that's something that I've heard you say before.
It's true. I think your invoice that you get will tell you that it happened, but you need some money coming in or it didn't happen.
I like your point of view. So, as we look at kind of the infrastructure piece here, Ian, let's talk a little bit about, the independence in selecting the right vendors, because you're not getting all the data you need in one place.
Right. I mean, there's multiple sources, and obviously VeriFacts is here as a source, but there are multiple sources, and obviously depending upon what you're looking to get, there's different centers of excellence, if you like, of who's providing that information. So when you look at a waterfall or building out, how am I going to go out and get data? It's really looking at don't get stuck in with one vendor. Don't let your environment prevent you from exercising your choice of what you want to do. So it's really that openness around being able to select who's the right vendor for you. could be multiple reasons as to who's the right vendor, but you need that ability to do that.
I think there's a lot of different reasons that you could, need multiple vendors, whether it be products, but also you're looking at different things. I might be getting addresses from one location and phone number data from another, and
Sure.
whatever social media information from yet another, and being able to combine that together. But what I've seen too often in this industry is those that control the infrastructure charging a toll to let the data in and out. And that's something that I'm not a huge fan of, because it's expensive enough to go get the data.
Yeah, right. So don't get constrained in other areas, right? So yeah, and then again, moving on from that, it's how do you get that data? How's data moving backwards and forwards, right? Traditional method is a flat file transfer, and when you're doing bulk, that's perfectly fine. But bulk isn't always the use case that you have. You often want just in time information. Right. So don't get locked into only being able to do it through one method. Yes, flat files, great, but the ability to leverage, what multiple vendors are offering is real-time APIs, real-time access to this data, on a case-by-case basis, depending on what you're looking for. So, that how you're handling that data flow is also critical to the success.
So let me ask it like this, Stephanie. How important is return time to your clients?
It's definitely crucial. So our clients are definitely looking at one of the matrix would be speed to location or speed to contact. So we perform a manual investigation, which can take some time. So one of the things we like to work through is making as many decisions up front once we receive a file to work as smart and as speedy as possible. So right up front, we're going to know probably what we're going to locate, what we're not. Let's return to the client right up front what we think is not locatable, particularly at a various price points. And then as we work through that file, maybe weekly sending those updates. We've closed this out, this is located, so that the client can work through that waterfall as quickly as possible. It is a very competitive space, particularly now. So the sooner we can make those decisions and help our clients do that, the better.
So it's something you're measuring. Go ahead, Ian.
Yeah, I was just going to say, and also from the third party side, from an agency collection standpoint, you may have work standards with your clients as to how quickly you're going to letter or outbound communication on those accounts, so that the timing is critical.
No, absolutely. And I mean, look, there's different data sources, right? So there's, VeriFacts is going through a manual verification process, right? Like they're picking up the phone, they're manually validating and verifying these things. Whereas you may have other data sources that you're able to bounce against, right? Like a scrub or SCRA scrub or whatever the case may be. So I think it's interesting that we look at it from that perspective. And it sounds like there's really become, originally we started saying, okay, there's flat files, and then we started working into APIs. And now it sounds like we have this more real-time mechanisms that are starting to become available. So Ian, can you talk a little bit about like that transition from that API format, which you can call, right? Like you can send out an API call, you can get that return response immediately, but you are taking a manual action, or it's happening over a period of time, versus that real time. Have you started to see that transition increase over the past couple of years?
Yes, most definitely. I mean, obviously I'm on the software vendor side of the house. So, we've seen multiple clients come back and say, okay, I'm working the account. I need to data dip and get some enhanced information here at this point in time. I've tried the phone numbers. I want to just quickly ping it, try and get a better number, better information about the account whilst I'm working it. So leveraging real time has become more of a request or a requirement from our client base. This is just that batch process. Obviously, batch has tremendous value, but real time is becoming more prevalent, I believe.
Well, and I think that kind of leads us to our next piece here, which is talking about the ability to manage the data in your system of record, because you need this, right? As a collection agency, a debt buyer, a creditor, or whatever, you need this system of record, right? Like you need to have a platform where you're managing your individual account records. And then what does that ultimately mean? And I think different organizations handle it differently, right? So, I mean, one of the things that we always talk about is that scalability, and however you're going to structure the storage and management of the data within your system, you need to find ways um, to make it scalable, right? Like the decisions that you make have to be able to work at scale, because even if you're starting, and I see this often, right? Like you see a smaller debt buyer that's starting out and they're buying one or two or a handful of portfolios. And so they're thinking about all their data in terms of the size of the data set that they have today and not considering the size of the data set 18 months from now. And then they find themselves in this constant rush to find a new way, right? Or to modify. Right. They're almost going through a system conversion very quickly because they didn't set themselves up for scalability.
Right. I mean, to your point, I start off and I think I'm good based upon, the inventory I've got that I'm working, right? Mm-hmm. But, old adage is, data will always expand to occupy the space available to it, right? Regardless of what you're going to do. And especially in our world, in the collections world, we have so much data, so much information, so much logging and tracking we have to do from a compliance standpoint, auditing standpoint, and so on. So, yeah, I mean, the ability to scale, not just that scaling, how many accounts can I deal with, but all of the ancillary data, your environment has to be able to scale to handle that. As we look at the evolution of accounts and how they move through their life cycle, they're continuously expanding. So, system of record scalability is we look at vertical and horizontal scalability. Vertical scalability is how expansive can I get? How can I scale my database, my environment, and so on. And then the horizontal is how do I scale to allow people access and in a timely manner with great responsiveness and so on. But the back end has to obviously be scalable, especially when we're talking about data and data waterfalls.
I think too, we know data is expensive. So you also want to make sure that records can link to other records. So if you're going to be able, if you have a data expense that is adding value or a piece of information that you need on one file, how many other accounts do you have that could be linked to that? Mm-hmm. So if you can pay once and use more than once, I think that's definitely the best way to go. So to make sure it's built in the most efficient way possible is also important.
That makes a lot of sense. Now, here comes the chicken and the egg question, though, right? Like, is it the appending of records, or are you managing this new data separately? And I think, yes, there's a lot of situational concerns or criteria to making that decision. But I'm curious as to, how you guys view this particular piece, because and I mean, ultimately what we're talking about here is, so I've got a system that has all of these consumer account records in it. Okay, so I have new data that's coming from VeriFacts or wherever. I now have that data. What am I doing with that data? Am I adding that to the individual account record, or am I putting this in some other table and connecting these records in some way? And I think different systems probably operate differently, but I feel like this is an important subject that's often overlooked in the waterfall process.
Yeah, I would agree with you 100%. But the way I look at it, you need to be able to do both, right? So I need to be able to capture what I got back from the vendors I'm working with. So I have that information separately from the account level record or the consumer level record, right? But I need to also try and avoid a lot of manual intervention. So as I get updates in, I do need to update those records. Now, whether I make that the primary data on the account or not, I've run in former life where we wanted to overlay the data as soon as we got it because we believed it to be the best. Others want to just keep it, have it available, and then as they're going through that collections process, leverage that data if they need to. So it's, you need both flavors, I think, depending upon your business model. But yeah, keeping it separate is one thing, just to have that history so I can look at, if I'm doing a request, if I request on this account, but I requested on this account last week, there's no value to that, right? So bouncing up against what I've done recently is has a tremendous value as well.
I think there's also a piece in there where if you're going to be running this data, you also need to track the outcome. So you want to know what you've done, what you've spent your money on, and then also use every piece of data that you've gathered to help in that decision making. So even though it may not be a verified piece of information, it might turn out to be incorrect. Um, it's giving you some resolution. It may be telling you, this person's unemployed. Let's stop this action that we were about to take.
Okay.
This person is, whatever. So you may have some resolution in there that you also need to track. And then kind of pairing that also with some trends. So when you're watching like the unemployment rate or consumers coming out of COVID, consumers are behaving a little bit differently. So knowing where to go back, if this person, lost their job or stopped working in 2020, there's probably a sweet spot in there to pick that up and try again. And that may be, 6 months down the road or whatever is happening with the economy. I know we've talked about tax time. Looking at consumer behavior. So watching that resolution and making sure you know when to go back and try again, I think is key.
Timing is everything, right? It's one thing to know how to do it. And I know you guys have heard me say this before, but the cash flow, the timing of the cash flow, the risk associated with the cash flow, this is another timing situation, right? And it's also a cash flow situation because you have an expenditure for these data sets, and then you need to figure out how fast are you being able to do your return on investment. We'll talk about that a little bit more as we get to the measure and adjust kind of portion of the discussion. Now, the last bullet point that we have here about building tables and automations, I think ties in and was covered by Ian as we talk about appending records and kind of managing those processes. So let's talk a little bit more about the data sources themselves, right? And so there's all these different places that we can get data, but just like everything else in our economy, the data is getting more expensive. So, Steph, I'm sure you're buying a lot of data to enable your team to do these manual verifications. What are you seeing in the marketplace in terms of the cost of data?
I think you kind of hit the nail on the head. It's really about return on investment. So I'm not super concerned about the cost of the data incoming. For me, it's, am I handling that data appropriately? Am I applying the right amount of labor time to that element of data? And am I really seeing a return on investment? And it's not really just me. It's also communicating that with the client. If we're finding this specific piece of information to support this specific strategy, did it work? If it did, I'm willing to spend quite a bit. And I know I've said to you before, I could find 100% of the consumers that are placed with us. It doesn't matter if my client didn't have a positive experience and have a positive ROI. So really, it takes a lot of communication, a lot of thought, a lot of planning. It's definitely not a, set it up and walk away situation. So for us, that's really what we're looking at is don't get sticker shock. Look at that return and see what's truly bringing benefit at the end of the day.
That's a fair statement. Well, let me ask you this, Steph. When you talk about hidden costs, right? I know we've talked about like there's rising costs of data, and we're going to talk a little bit about kind of the labor. But what are some of the other hidden costs that people should be looking at when it comes to buying data?
I think you can have a certain amount of hit rate. You're going to want to look at dispute rates, knowing how many times you have to go back to dispute information with the client or with the vendor. How much of a headache was that? Was it an easy process? Wasn't it? You're looking at, ops time, client services time, IT time, a lot of back and forth. So looking at the data quality, ease of use, ease of transferring that data, all of that, if you can't control that, can really drive up the cost of setting something like this up.
Well, I know one of the things that you've mentioned to me in the past was about how much labor is actually required on the part of the client. And so that's one of those kind of like hidden little pieces that tends to be overlooked, because if I'm buying data that then requires me to spend an additional 1 to 2 hours, or even 3 minutes per account, I mean, I have to factor in that, because what's the most expensive thing in pretty much every business? People.
Labor.
Right? Labor. The people are the
Labor.
most expensive part. So, that's a big expenditure. And anytime that I have my people doing something, I need to concern myself with the cost of having my people do that thing. So, help me better understand what you mean by that. I know this is something we've talked about when I've been in the VeriFacts office, or, when we're hanging out at a conference or whatever, but what are people, what's a law firm or a debt buyer or an agency spending their time on once they've purchased data? What's that manual process?
I think it depends on where you're at in the waterfall process. Some of the data that's returned is unverified. Kind of look at your data source too. What's the likelihood of this to be correct?
Mm-hmm.
What type of data did you do the matching on? Was it name, address, social? Was it name, address, or like last or first initial, last name? Like, you got to kind of look at that data matching too to see what created that lead. So that's, I think, is a piece of it, knowing what data sources are in there. But also, like, I know for us exactly how much it costs for us to do verifications for every minute. So I have to add onto it. So it's just looking really at that combined cost. And then for the client, depending on the data that they're getting back or the type of guarantee or quality assurance behind that, they're probably re-verifying that information as well. We need to be, if somebody's wrong, you're looking at a court costs, you're looking at issues with service of process. And when I look at some of our clients, we have a lot of law firm clients. When I look at their processes, I see so many times they took, A, B, C, D, and then all of a sudden have to jump back and do a re-verification or add a data element in, and then take 5 more steps forward and 3 steps back because we have to go back, re-verify something. You know what I mean? And
Sure.
in my mind, I just keep thinking how much a minute is every single step back. So to get as much as you can up front, know what you've got, have that quality piece of data right when you need it, can avoid some of those steps forward and a little step back and a few more steps forward. I think every time there's that step back, you're looking at a lot of labor time there.
Well, it feels like there's a balance here too, because the other thing that we talk about is, pay for what you're going to use, but nothing else, right? So it sounds like you have to find the perfect balance between, am I asking for everything I'm going to need throughout the entire process, and am I asking for too much? How do you direct somebody to find that balance?
I think it's really just conversation. So working with a client more in a consultative role, saying, let's really sit down. I don't want to pitch you something in 5 minutes. I would really love to sit down with you, look at your process from beginning to end, and really take a consultative approach and brainstorm with your team. I mean, our clients they know their business better than I do. So to sit down and really talk it through, do some brainstorming, do some testing. But again, I would never set something up and walk away. I think you just always have to continue to tweak it. But I think taking that time up front to talk through everything that you can provide, everything that they need, and then looking for those elements of crossover, even maybe building something together, bringing in other partners. I think there's a lot of things that can be done up front to make sure your process is complete, efficient, and getting you that outcome for whatever strategy you have in mind.
There's another piece to the cost as well, and we didn't kind of pull it out here. And when it gets to costing, right, don't pay to get something back that you know is already bad, right? So if I've already determined that an address or a phone number is bad, I don't want to pay to get that same hit back again, right? So just that ability when you're working with your vendor to be able to, dedupe, right? Don't return back to me what I already know is bad, and don't charge me for that, right? So if you're not careful about that, you're going to get charged for things you already know are bad.
Yeah, I think knowing you want to have those deduping processes in place is important. Again, it's not always as black and white. So we will have some clients, it happens a lot, where they believe an element of data is incorrect, and we're able to say it's actually correct. So we were able to confirm, name and social or whatever is living here or working here. And that also takes some trust back and forth to say, I think maybe, maybe someone moved back, maybe someone started a job again, maybe someone was not being truthful. I don't know if that's ever happened to anyone in this industry before, but I've seen it, So, but it's like, it takes some communication to say, where we didn't think they were, they're there, let's go back and try again. But big picture, you always want to dedupe things, but keep that communication open.
Right. And a lot of that, is it good, is it bad, it is also time-based, right? So, I have a phone, but it's been disconnected, but it gets reconnected. Yeah. So when I tried it before, it was disconnected, so it was a bad number. But, going forward, is it still a bad number? And that's where the verification piece really takes.
Yeah, what makes it bad? Was it that it's truly bad information? Was that it wasn't a positive connection? Was that there's a lot of different things. So good and bad also has some shades of gray.
Relative, right? Everything in this world is relative. So the good and bad. But what I find, the point that you guys bring up that I find to be really interesting here is that data is perishable, right? The value of data is perishable based on a timeline. So just like we look at liquidation curves and we say that we're going to be able to collect this much over this period of time, I just know that they're trending down. But you can kind of say the same thing, that the value of the portfolio is up here and it's starting to trend its way down over a period of time. It's an interesting perspective, because I think when we think about buying data, we're like, oh, we bought something, right? You buy a car, it's the same car tomorrow. It's not, it's not depreciating at that same level. But it's an interesting takeaway from some of the things you guys are talking about here. But also, now we start talking about kind of the processing power and the production speed. And this goes back to what we were talking about in terms of how to pass files and those kinds of things. But how are you managing this processing power? Because again, big data, right? And we can look at big data as an example. We've been able to draw a lot of conclusions from big data, but it takes an insane amount of processing power to do such, to organize that much information and then display it or understand it in a way in which it has an actual effect on a business. And so, I find that to be interesting. I know, Ian, you've spent a lot of time working on the efficiencies and automation of pushing that data in and out and being able to process or better understand some of that data once it's been collected. Can you talk a little bit about, I've got all this disparate information, how am I organizing it?
Yeah, so there's a couple of pieces here that you kind of threw out, and that's the automation piece, right? I don't want to have to introduce a whole bunch of manual steps in a waterfall. I have a business process. My business process says do this, yes? So I want to automate that as much as possible, take out that human intervention, the cost, potential for error, and so on. So, whatever I can do to automate increases the efficiencies. And we talked a little bit about timeliness as well as around turnaround, right? So, if I want to be efficient in that, I need to be automating that process rather than saying, okay, it's Friday, I have to send my file off, right? So, there's that piece to it. But also, we also touched on it on a previous point, which is how do I associate that information, that data, back to the accounts, across multiple accounts? If I got multiple accounts for the same person, how am I dealing with that? Oftentimes, we link or tie those accounts together because we can. The business says we can do that. So yes, I really only need it once, but there are situations where you break that link. So I need to be able to push that data across the multiple accounts if I need to, but I don't want to do that manually. That has to be a systemic way within the system of record to handle, how do I manage this data? And the other piece to that is, when I do get those returns back, I get updated information. How do I want to drive a business process, right, to leverage that on a timely basis?
Mm-hmm.
I need to know this new data. I need to be able to act upon that data. And when you're dealing with, high volumes of accounts, trying to do that on a manual basis is really just not practical, totally inefficient, costs you a lot of money. So automating those processes of what do I do now I've got some updated information on the account.
I think that's important, especially as we talk about all of this data. It's got to come into somewhere. We have to organize it. And then, you guys have really kind of honed in on the multiple accounts under the same consumer. And I think that is, again, something that often gets overlooked. But if a consumer owes one agency or one debt buyer, they generally owe more than one. And it's not uncommon to think that multiple, they may have multiple with the same bank or the same credit union, but ultimately that may trickle down to them having them with the same debt buyer or agency.
Sure.
And you're communicating in multiple ways. And, I find that to be kind of an interesting piece. But, as we've talked about the data itself, we've talked about the data constantly evolving. And when we were chatting the other day preparing for this webinar, one of the things we talked about is how many people under 30 are using Facebook. And other than to interact with their great Aunt Mildred in Norway, they're probably not spending a lot of time on Facebook under 30. I mean, Steph, you have 2 daughters. Are they active on Facebook or other social?
They are not active on Facebook. Honestly, I hear new things every day. They tell me they're on new things. I don't even know what they are. So I'm on Facebook, and I'm extremely not technically challenged. I'm way over 30. But no, we definitely need to keep an eye on new ways. I guess, where are you going to show up on social media? We need to look at different generations. Not only where can we find these people or where can we make connections with them, but now we have the added benefit of wanting, how do they want to communicate? So I think it takes a lot of thought and preparation to put you really have to think like you are the consumer and I am this age and this is where I am and this is how I want to talk to you. I think it's just different than it was 10 years ago. Mm-hmm. So I don't know, we need to keep listening and learning, and things are just changing so quickly. So our strategy it's not even going to last year to year. So we just need to keep evolving. It's just always something new. It's not like you can call someone on their landline phone. Do you know what I mean? For example, and we used to be able to do that. That's not going to happen. Mm-hmm. So we need to put ourselves in the seat of the consumer and think like they think.
Right. And to your point, it's generational too, right? So how I want to interact, yes. Mm-hmm. Me, I'm a little older. Call me on the phone, that's fine. But different generations prefer different methods of communication. So when you're looking to do a data waterfall, I need to be able to get the data that's relevant for that particular person, age group, social classification, whatever, right? So it's really shifted more to that consumer preference because you have a higher success rate in trying to communicate with them.
Just to be clear, I fall into that bracket that prefers text and email over all.
Well, I'm in the bracket that says, a few years ago, the thing was, I don't want to talk to a machine. I want to talk to a person. Now it's like, I don't want to talk to anybody. Let me self-service. Right?
Just send me a text. I can get to it when I can get to it.
I love talking, so you can send me a piece of mail. I'll answer.
I still do a lot of that. I still do.
You can text me. So I don't know that everyone's like that.
I still love a good handwritten card, and I found that to be an incredibly effective sales and marketing tool. Just saying.
There's zero chance that my kids would ever answer a telephone call. That's never, ever, ever going to happen. Never.
So
So
I mean,
maybe if you're lucky, they'll text with you.
if you're lucky.
If you're lucky.
And so I know when we talk about the consumer communication preferences, that was a big factor in RegF, right? And rolling that out across agencies. That probably brought some of its own challenges with it, right? Because we're not necessarily, it's like some of it is data that's sent from the creditor, or hopefully will be sent from the creditor at some point in time, please. But the rest of that comes down to like collecting that information from a variety of vendors and consolidating it on an account basis. What did that look like for you?
Building out the system to be able to handle that, house that data, track, when it changed, who changed it, how did I get this, how did I get this information, how I verified it, and so on. Especially when you get down to consent, right? My preferred method of communication is via text. Do I have consent to text you? Right. So being able to manage that systemically, was a challenge. Tracking preferences in RegF was a huge one too. When you talk about methods, of communication, don't ever email me at my work address. Don't phone me between these hours on a work number or these hours on a home number. So bringing all of that information in, if we can capture that systemically, fantastic. If the data sources that can provide that are collecting that information elsewhere. Otherwise, yes, we're obligated to have it and track it, but there's a lot of human intervention involved in capturing that data if that information isn't available through a vendor partner to do that.
Fair enough. And kind of the last thing as we talk about the data sources is looking at new ways to use existing data, right? Sometimes you have a data set already and you have to find new ways to leverage that or extract value from the data set that you have. I think one of the great examples is DRN data, right? Jeremiah Wheeler and his team, and what they've been able to do, they've been out there scanning these license plates for over a decade. They have all of this data consolidated, and then how do you find new value in it? Well, you could use it for process service location, you could use it for address locations, you could use it for all of these different purposes and reasons, but that data set already existed. And now that company's finding new ways to leverage that data, whether it be in conjunction with law firms, debt buyers, creditors, et cetera, to determine, different factors. I mean, if somebody says that they work at the local car wash, but yet their car never shows up there, you have to wonder whether or not they work there, right? Starts to draw some interesting questions, but a data set that that already existed, that they found new application for the data itself. I find those kinds of things to be interesting, and I think that's one of those differentiators that organizations are able to find these days. And I know, Steph, we've talked about all the data that you guys collected and all the different products you've been able to create from data sets that you already had, even creating data, like creating new products from the byproduct of other products, which in the data game is really cool.
It's that resolution. It's trying to.
It's like Rockefeller selling.
What can you do with every single piece of information you have? It is telling a story. So don't look at, you've got 100 data sets. Don't pick 3. You know what I mean? You really have to look at everything, and it will tell you probably your best next step.
So let's talk a little bit about the data sourcing strategy, right? We've talked about what the data sources are, where we can find them, those kinds of things. Let's talk a little bit about the strategy that goes behind that. And Steph, this is where I'm just going to kind of ask you a question, then I'm going to shut up and sit in the corner while you demonstrate the expertise of
my favorite part.
But this is something that I've heard you talk with a number of different your clients through the years about how you kind of help them from a strategy perspective. Now, you may be selling the products over here, but you look at the whole data waterfall with them in terms of developing a strategy based on the data sources that they have and where and how they're going to track and manage that data on the backside. So when you're meeting with XYZ customer, law firm, whatever, about their waterfall and how they're leveraging the data that they're leveraging today, how do you have that conversation with them, balancing like the cost savings and the competition amongst data sources?
This is probably the most fun thing. This is my favorite thing to do with a client. Um, and just knowing a bit about it, of the market, about probably where the client's head is at. So what is their goal right now? Are they, and the goal can change at any time depending on the market, competition, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So we need to be ready to say, are you in a mode where you're trying to save money?
Mm-hmm.
That's a whole new ball game. Versus I'm fighting for market share. I need to be first. I'm ready to invest some money. I'm in third place. I need to be in first place. How do I get there? So these discussions are much more different depending on why we're even having this conversation. You're looking to set up a data waterfall. Why? What are you trying to get out of it? So I think that's probably the most fun. Let's find ways to take what you're doing today and give you a 10% reduction in cost. We can figure that out. Like we know what's working where, what isn't, what to cut, what to add. It's just a lot of different tweaks. But if you are in a competitive space, and many of our clients are, I know we are as well, you're fighting for that market share. You want it's driving your business. It's going to let you know what accounts you're going to get, how many accounts you're going to get, the quality of those accounts, and those are the moments when it gets maybe a little bit more fun. So we have a client, they're working with a network or something. They're in third place. They want to get in first place. Let's figure out how to be as fast as possible. We need to invest money in the right way, and we need to ramp up your money in the door quick. So those are some fun conversations to have. But again, they're very different. So I know, we've done a lot of work with agencies on the Department of Education over many years, an extremely competitive space. So what's going to happen with that, I don't know. But looking backwards, we'd get a scorecard every quarter. We knew where all of our clients were standing. We knew who was trying to move into what ranking. And it was just fun. We'd sit down and develop a plan to try to get them over that hump, and then to see the results is exciting. So I don't know, those are just fun things. Like maybe you're worried about compliance. Maybe you're worried how many times could you be speaking to the wrong consumer? That's very scary. So maybe that's your goal. Maybe we need to make sure that every action you take is buttoned up so tight that you're speaking to that correct person. You're making contact at the right time to the right person. There could be just a million different things that you're trying to work through. But those conversations are the most fun, probably, when trying to build something successful with a partner or client.
Well, finding that balance between performance and compliance is, I think, everybody's primary objective these days. Compliance is table stakes just to even be at the big kids table, right? And so that's the bottom line, and I think there's that inverse relationship between compliance and performance, because you may be able to squeeze more performance, but are you matching the same level of compliance? And I think that's an interesting kind of take on it. Now, when we talk about, and you kind of covered everything that we've got on our slide here, when you're talking about that cost savings versus competition, right? And the first question is, what are you actually trying to accomplish? Why were you here? What would you say you do here, right? I don't want to get too bobs about it, but like, what would you say you do here? And understanding where we're trying to get to, you can never get to your final destination if you don't know where it is.
Sure. There's another thing to play into this too, balancing cost and success, especially on a third-party type model. Let's not spend $1 to collect a dime, right? Understand your business, understand your recovery rates, understand your fees, how that structures, and manage your waterfall to maximize that versus just keep on plugging in the same account and keep spending more money and just not recovering, right? So it's that cost success also takes into account how much have I invested so far,
Mhm.
and how much more am I looking to invest in that success model, defining success.
I think you're right on point there. And now we can kind of talk a little bit about how we layer those data sources, right? So it's if you've got 5 different data providers and you're leveraging 9 different products, how are you going to layer those on top of each other? Because data waterfall, it's called a data waterfall for a reason, right? Because you're running one plane and then you're sending it somewhere else, then you're collecting more data, and each time you're collecting more data as you go through the process, because you're trying to collect without having to spend more dollars. But if you have to spend more dollars, you need that data to be new, and you're probably not sourcing new data from the same location repeatedly on the same account. So how does that start to look? And I know stuff like, as you talked about, there's always a balance there. So I always thought you manage your waterfall by starting with less expensive data costs, drill down and spend more as individual data that you have is not helping the account to move forward. I don't, from my perspective, that was a question from the audience. I don't know if you guys can see that in the chat. But Keith, my response to that would be, I don't think it's always about less expensive data costs. I think it's about the most effective tool sets and balancing the cost and the performance. Because if I've got 90% of my account, or I'm only knocking off 10% of my accounts on that first layer of the waterfall because I'm underspending and it's costing me a dime, maybe I want to spend 25 cents on that first channel and have 40% of my accounts collectible on that first stage. So I think from a mathematical standpoint, it can always it could always change based on what data you're collecting and what's the purpose of the data that you're collecting.
Yeah, and I think it also depends on the quality of the data you're starting with as well. I mean, historically, let's say you're getting a placement or you purchased a portfolio, if you determine that it's 60% accuracy on the data elements that you're looking for, how do I feed that into a waterfall, and at what point do I do that? Versus somewhere where you're getting a placement where historically, the data is so old, I may as well throw it in the waterfall out the gate. Right? So understanding the business you have and what process you want to go through based upon your previous experiences, I think plays in significantly.
I'll go back to
the balance of the account, the type of the account. And again, I know I sound like a broken record, but it's really return on investment at each level. And then you got to lay speed on top of that. So, and hidden costs. I mean, it's just, you could go on and on. There's so many things to think about. But traditionally, I do see a lot of waterfalls created based simply on price. And I don't think that it's wrong. I don't think it's necessarily wrong. It's probably, you're going to be probably doing that if your objective is cost savings. If you do want to have that more competitive aspect to what you're creating, you're going to want to look more at speed. So it may be worth it to you to spend more on that first step. But to knock, like Adam said, instead of finding 10%, what if you could find 40% up front? And then 2, at the end of that waterfall, you need to look at your overall total cost. So if you are averaging, if you set up a waterfall least expensive to most, and you are kind of just rolling it down the line, at the end of the day, what did it really cost you as a combined rate for a verified piece of information, or a usable piece of information that yielded a return? So you may find out that at the end of the day, it costs $45 a locate, and you could have maybe just done that up front. You know what I mean? You could have done spent the exact same money in 10 days that took 6 months. So it just depends on how fast you also just want that information back. Some of our clients also have staffing constraints. They don't want me to find 50% of a file in a week. Then what are we going to do with it? So you sometimes do need to time that through to the client to make sure nothing's sitting or aging when it's
unnecessarily.
Not necessarily. Yes, unnecessarily, so that it makes sense for the staff that's receiving it as well.
Well, and I think that brings us, because we're down to the last couple of minutes here, but that also brings us to, I think we covered a lot of the things about data layering as we talked about kind of the pricing and basing it on ROI or basing it based on price, depending on what your expectation and goals are. But I think the last piece of the puzzle that we always talk about is measure and adjust, right? And this is the same thing if you're developing software or bringing in data or whatever. You have to constantly measure what has happened and then adjust your strategy accordingly, measure again, right? And that's how we grow and learn. But the one thing that I can't remember where we were, Stephanie, when you said this, but it was no strategy is absolute. Right. And I think that that's an interesting, it changed my perspective on the data waterfall process. And it might have been like regional event a couple of years ago or something, but we were talking about like data flow in general. And that was a statement that really stuck with me, saying that no strategy is absolute, meaning we can build the latest and greatest that works on January 18th, 2023. But on January 19th, 2024, is that strategy still the best strategy? And am I continuing to measure and adjust my strategy to ensure that I'm staying on track with changing times? Because what if Instagram starts to die, or people stop using LinkedIn this year and they start using the XYZ platform? Like, have I accounted for that in my strategy, how people are behaving?
It's just wild. I think it's an endless thing to look at. Luckily, it's a challenge, but it keeps us all employed. You know what I mean? We can't just do it once and walk away. So it keeps us, relevant, I guess. So, no, absolutely. And I think of probably my favorite relationships with clients are where we do talk every month.
Mhm.
And I look at every time they place, I want to let them know if I was sitting in your shoes, I would send me more of this, less of this, and let's just keep tweaking it.
Mhm.
And looking at best practice, I suggest literally monthly. I'm looking at almost every placement that comes in, and this one performed really well. This one didn't. What are the things we've learned, even in the last 30 days, that can keep making those tweaks? So it's just we can't ever get lazy. We can't be lazy. We have to keep talking, analyzing, measuring, and I would say every 30 days we can make some improvement that's going to keep you ahead of the curve.
Well, optimization is a constantly moving target. That's
Mhm.
something that I preach to my internal staff with all of my different organizations, that we can continue to optimize, but that's a moving target. We can always do better, right? We can always find new and interesting ways, but it comes down to work effort. And I think, as I look at the structure of debt buyers, agencies, law firms, a lot of the organizations that seem to have the greatest success over the past couple of years are those that have one or more people in their organization that are tasked with managing the data, identifying sources, measuring that ROI, measuring and adjusting for the future. But they have somebody who, it's not an afterthought. They're also building, dialing campaigns, but when someone is actually focused on the data. Have you seen the same thing?
Yeah, it's strategy management, right? It is basically what it is.
Really
And
cool.
I think there's been a shift to that over time here, and it's become more critical, as we look for efficiencies and optimizations. Is what's the best strategy for this portfolio? What's the best strategy for this demographic? What's the best strategy for this? And unless you're looking at that information, you're collecting, you're getting back your result sets and so on. That's how you have to constantly refine that, right? Nothing is absolute. It's constantly evolving. It's constantly changing. What is it? No plan of battle survives the first shot, right? So I have a strategy. It doesn't mean it's going to work as we move forward. I need to be able to continuously review that, manage that, and adjust as I go through that process.
I think Mike Tyson said it best. Everybody's got a plan until they get punched in the mouth. So, looking at and evaluating the dollars that are being generated from the individual processes, right? And this goes back to what Steph said at the beginning. There's no value in locating 100% and collecting 0%, right? It's great, and we have to look at the data sets as a function of what we're trying to accomplish in the overall, right? And so that comes down to our speed to the ROI as well, and how quickly are we accomplishing that goal of locating however many and collecting the dollars that ultimately we're here to collect. Can't overlook the fact that we're here to collect dollars, right? Like we may be the receivables management industry, but we are debt collectors by trade, and our objective is to collect debt in a fair and compliant way.
Mhm.
So with all of that being said, and I know that we've got a couple of other points here about scoring and collections and locations. And I guess, Steph, this is kind of my last question for you is the scoring, collections, and locations are different metrics, right? So when I'm scoring propensity to pay versus scoring for locations, those are very different evaluations. Can you help me understand what you kind of refer to there?
They definitely are. They're very much separate for us. So we're relying on our clients to send us the best accounts and what they believe. They know the collections business better than I do. We're relying on them to score those accounts and give us the best, set us up for the best outcome. But we're looking at what's the likelihood of me to locate this individual.
Mm-hmm.
So that kind of, in my mind, comes after that. So we want to piece out the best accounts. Then we want to figure out who we can find, how difficult they're going to be to find, how easy, and then price it accordingly. So they're definitely in different worlds, but they need to be able to work together.
Absolutely. Well, both of you, Ian, Steph, I really appreciate you coming on and having this chat with me today. I think this was a great conversation and something that's often overlooked. We spend a lot of money on data as an industry, and better understanding how we can leverage that data, improve our ROIs, and just create a better and more efficient environment, I think is key for every organization in our space. For anybody watching, if you have additional questions, we'll be posting this to YouTube as well. You can leave comments or questions on YouTube or LinkedIn as we post this kind of replay on Friday. But guys, thank you so much for participating today. I really appreciate you.
My pleasure.
Thank you for having us. This is fun.
Yes.
Adam.
Well, I'll see both of you at the RMAI conference in 3 weeks. But until then, thank you so much, everybody. We'll talk to you again soon.
Thank you.